Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The United States Supreme Court says that tribal police can search non-Indians who are found on reservations. The justice's unanimous ruling further affirms the limited sovereignty for indigenous nations. We're going to talk about why this is important and also the limits to it. We can search them, we might be able to detain them, but can we prosecute them? Also, the Navajo Nation becomes the largest tribe in the United States after the pandemic enrollment surge. A rush to secure federal benefits during the coronavirus pandemic basically accelerated the enrollment in the Navajo Nation, which pushed its population past that of the Cherokee Nation to nearly 400,000. That's according to an article in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. We've got a lot to talk about, but of course, no conversation on American Indians would be complete without
True Chat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, why do you care? These are the original Americans. These are the original people on this land that many of us call home. And the way we treat them, I think, shows how we believe people should be treated. So that's why I think this is an important episode today. And as you know, we've talked about the Native Americans often on this show in the past. And so it's time for a little update on what's going on. Word of the day, jurisdiction, jurisdiction, 4 syllables, used as a noun. And it's interesting because it has different meanings, and Justin referred to a couple of them there. The administering of justice, the authority or legal power to hear and decide cases. That's the number 1. 2, the authority or power in general, or as it's used in this article, the range or sphere of authority or the territory in general. So it can mean trying the cases, or it can mean, well, you're just in charge of some things in this region. And so there's our word of the day. Justin, where are we going to start?
Well, so we've got to talk about, obviously, the Supreme Court. The last time that I think we spoke about some Native American issues, we discussed the Oklahoma situation, which for those that don't know, is basically essentially saying in July that Congress never officially dissolved the 5 tribal reservations that encompass much of eastern Oklahoma, putting in question the state court convictions of Indians for crimes committed in the territory. In 2019, the court held that Indian hunting rights also remained intact despite the advent of Wyoming statehood in 1890. So there's been a few cases from 2019, 2020 that we've reviewed that have been what I think many would call significant wins. It's difficult, I think, to call them wins because it's kind of like it's the way that it should be. So I'm not sure that it's a victory so much as it's just doing the right thing. But I think Lance and I have both been encouraged, and I think it's wonderful to see that the Supreme Court unanimously, there is no dissenting opinion because they were all in consensus that this is absolutely the way it should be. And when you have that, I think those are the kinds of things that should send a very strong message to the nation. I mean, how often do we get, a unanimous Supreme Court ruling? And that should send a strong message that, we have more work to do, obviously, because these are interesting things that are happening and they're certainly probably long overdue. But we're not there yet because really, Lance, right? The deal here is basically what happened is there was a police officer, a tribal police officer, who found a pickup truck running on the side of the road, and the ignition's on. There's a guy in there. There's a small kid, clearly a non-tribal member, and so he decides to place him in the back of his cruiser, searches the vehicle, finds methamphetamine, and calls in, local law enforcement, county, right, and state officials to handle the prosecution. Because if you don't know, they can't prosecute non-members non-tribal members, even if you're found committing a crime on their reservation, which is
doesn't make a lot of sense, does it?
Like I told Lance, it's if I don't know, right? If somebody from the UK came over to the United States and broke one of our laws, and then we weren't able to prosecute him, even though they were sitting here on our soil and had broken our rules, I don't know. It seems kind of, bogus that we would not be okay with that, right? In any other context. So why is it okay for us to behave that way toward what are supposedly sovereign nations inside of our territory, right? Well, clearly they're not, because they lack the ability to do that. At the same time, the reason that story is important is it's because that's what brought up this issue of, did that police officer have the right to detain and search that person who was not a member of the tribe? And
because in the legal realm, if they don't have the right to stop them and search them, then they're in all likelihood, me as the defendant, then nobody would have been called and I wouldn't be facing jail time and losing, if that was my child, the right to see my child. So that's my defense, is like, wait a minute, this was an illegal stop, illegal search and seizure, that they don't have the right to do this, because they went ahead and the tribal officer went ahead and called local and state officials to come in and take over the investigation. But my claim as a defense would be, well, this was an illegal search and seizure, which is, that's the way I take it. I don't know about you. That's the way I take it. And the courts then had to decide, was this an illegal search and seizure?
Right. And obviously the issue became that lower courts basically were saying that it was. It made it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, no, it's not. He had reasonable suspicion, and he had the legal authority to search and detain. Again, key here is the court is saying, nah, he doesn't have, you don't have the right to prosecute this individual. But you can search him, you can detain him, and you can bring in your county and state authorities that are part of the U.S. governmental system and the state governmental system, right? And they can then take over and prosecute and take it from there. And in this case, it worked the way that we're sold on it's supposed to work, right? I think generally from what we know about the story, right, this was pretty reasonable. He finds a guy in the middle of the night with a pickup truck on. He seems, out of it kind of, and he's got a small kid and he's just sitting on the side of the road with his truck running, on an Indian reservation, and clearly not, a member of the nation. It seems kind of suspicious.
Well, and as the article says, several semi-automatic weapons in the cab.
Right. Yeah.
Which out west we know is different than if you're living in New York City or LA, that has a different,
right.
There's a different lifestyle out in the West, but still, right. You're driving a truck with a small child, methamphetamines, a glass pipe, and semi-automatic weapons.
It's probably reasonable
we need to
too.
question this. All right. You may be okay, but I think most of us would say, yeah, I'm not sure I want to meet that person on the road. So,
obviously detains him, right? And it worked like it's supposed to. The tribal police did what they did, which is right, call the quote unquote higher up officials. He was prosecuted, found guilty, yada, yada.
But again, can I say again, in this time of when we're hearing, we've spent all this time, in many cases, rightfully so, hearing some negative stories about police officers. Here's a case in point where everybody did their job properly.
Yes.
And we just tend to gloss over that and accept that. Now, it doesn't undo all of what I believe are horrible things that some police officers have done. But again, it reminds me of that Michael Jackson song, one bad apple doesn't spoil the whole bunch. There are, the majority of police officers are out there doing the job correctly, protecting us, doing it right. And sometimes we need to stop and focus on that, because we tend to, in the media and on our algorithms on our phone, We look up negative things so we think everything that's going on is negative. Here's a case in point where everybody involved did their job all the way up to the Supreme Court. Hey, you know what? The system works, right? Sometimes, more times than not, the system works. Occasionally it doesn't. You're right. And we all get upset about that when it doesn't. But no system is perfect. But this is a case in point to me where the system has worked.
Yeah, there's no question going forward, right, that tribal police now have the ability. I mean, they technically have always had the ability based on the opinion, but they, as a tribal police officer, right, I don't then have to wonder, okay, is it going to do any good to do anything about this? Because it's just going to, you have to wonder that because unfortunately you can't necessarily count, right, on county and state officials doing maybe what they should do, federal officials. But as Lance pointed out, in this instance, it all did work. I think it opens up the larger question, which is what we want to discuss coming up and we kind of said this before, if you can search and detain them, why can't you prosecute them? Which is a greater question of, well, that's because we don't necessarily, we say, right, that they have sovereignty, but then we sort of qualify that and say, well, it's limited sovereignty, right? You've got sovereignty until we don't want you to have sovereignty. And then we just get to do whatever we want, which we'll let you think about here. Let us know your thoughts on that. Send us an email, podcast@thestateofus.org, podcast@thestateofus.org. How should it work, right? Should it be limited sovereignty or should they have full sovereignty? Well, it's a big question and we're going to talk about it. Keep it here on The State of Us and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Lance, we've got all these tribes across the United States. We've been trying to cover American Indian affairs for quite some time, right? What's going on? The Indian Health Service has been a large focus of ours, and the often abhorrent care that is provided to American Indians in this country, which is just, atrocious. I mean, we've talked about some of that before. They let doctors in who have literally been fired from any other respectable healthcare institution anywhere. And often you have many people that die who are in the quote unquote care of the Indian Health Service that didn't need to die, right? There was no good reason that they should have died. And because you've got quite an array of unsavory folk who are hired, unqualified possibly folk, they, often are subjugated to terrible treatment. Now, just like with everything, right? I feel it's important that we put in a piece there for the Indian Health Service that there are some wonderful people who work for the Indian Health Service who really are there trying to do good. But even the people that want to do good are plagued by, chronic underfunding of the system, inadequate access to supplies, inadequate access to technology. So, even if you want to do a really good job, you're going to be limited because you may not have access to what you need to do a really good job. So the question that we left folks with, which now we're going to get Lance's expert answer to, is the United States, right, with its various Indian tribes, has sort of a limited sovereignty setup where the nations sort of have sovereignty. They have sovereignty sort of over their own people, if they're officially members of the tribe, and if it's within their territory, and if our government doesn't determine that there's a larger federal purpose served at play, right? Because we think of them as, well, sovereign would mean that they have control over their own destiny. But ultimately, as the justices pointed out in this Supreme Court decision, Congress is the ultimate authority for everything, not the tribes themselves. So when it comes down to it, Congress can basically decide almost anything if it wants to, like dissolving a treaty, which then could completely invalidate the existence of certain tribes. Now, that might be legally challenged, but Congress has the ability to end treaties, as we know, right, from our basic history classes. So there's really nothing permanent that secures their sovereignty. It's sort of by the grace of the mighty federal government of the United States that they may exist. So is that something we should change? And if so, how do we change it?
Well, I find it interesting, and you kind of started to delve into it there, but you used the phrase their territory. And what a misnomer, and hopefully you had a basic history class where this was explained to you. But the land that these Indian nations are on now, as you stated, were from treaties signed and broken and re-signed with the American government, with Congress over the last 150, 200 years. And so these people are living on land that the United States government has basically said, we don't want. And there has been times in the past, the most famous probably are in the Black Hills of the Dakotas, where gold was discovered, and the Indians were moved off of that land to another land because the American government wanted the gold that was on that land. So as you pointed out, the history here is that they have whatever sovereignty the Congress wants to give them. And basically that means you stay out of our way, you stay out of sight, and we'll leave you alone. That's sad. I mean, it's just, if you've ever been to these places, to these reservations, to this anointed sovereign land that the Indians now have, the American Indians now have, it should make you irate. There are horrible conditions. They're, like I already stated, in land where nobody else wants to live. There aren't any factories. There are no jobs close. Many times there are no paved roads. There are no grocery stores. Boy, we're like having our cake and eating it too, as the American government, as the American people. It's like, we're going to give you the worst land ever, and then we're going to tell you how to live, except when we don't care, then you can do what you want. That's the way I see this, and I think it's really bad that it's this way. I think we need to be doing more for these people. As you said, their health, the health crisis is horrible anyway, much less than during the pandemic. As one of the articles points out, that they're vulnerable because they have diseases like diabetes, the scarcity of running water for washing their hands, and homes with several generations living under the same roof. But it's almost out of sight, out of mind. If this were going on in urban areas, in metropolitan cities, people would be up in arms, and the local TV and print reporters would be covering this, and we'd have all kinds of stories on it. And instead, you have to dig through to find things on the situation that's going on out here. And it's just appalling. And it's something that I've always been interested in. And we almost, when my family moved to Ohio, one of my dad's job offers was to live and teach on an Indian reservation out west. And I almost went there, and I was 12 years old and did a lot of research and study at that time for the 3 different jobs that my dad was looking at taking. And I always wondered, should I have been out there? It's because it's just one of those things where, my goodness, the proud being of these people and what we've subjected them to over the years. It's just like, if you want to do something to make the world a better place, here's a perfect opportunity.
From the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA.gov, so this is from the federal government Bureau of Indian Affairs, there's a Q&A, frequently asked questions section on their website, and one of them is, what are inherent powers of tribal self-government? The answer: tribes possess, and this is from the United States federal government, tribes possess all powers of self-government except those relinquished under treaty with the United States, those that Congress has expressly extinguished, and those that the federal courts have ruled are subject to existing federal law or are inconsistent with overriding national policies. Tribes, therefore, possess the right to form their own governments, to make and enforce laws, both civil and criminal, to tax, to establish and determine membership, to license and regulate activities within their jurisdiction, to zone, and to exclude persons from tribal lands. Limitations on inherent tribal powers of self-government are few, but do include the same limitations applicable to states. For example, neither tribes nor states have the power to make war, engage in foreign relations, or print and issue currency.
And can I just very quickly point out that many of those treaties were signed by American Indians who were not the leaders of the people that they signed for.
Sure,
the American
forcibly
government
signed in a lot of cases.
And then let's add to the fact that even those treaties that were signed by the proper leaders of the Indian nations were done under duress, because it was basically, yeah, we're going to starve you and your people are all going to die, or you can sign this treaty. So let's not get this notion in our heads that the United States was awe-inspiring and respectable in this whole treaty process. So when you say, well, you can do everything except what was in the treaty, well, the Indian nations didn't have any say-so in the treaty. And many times they were forced to follow a treaty that their leaders didn't sign. Think about how we would feel if somebody came in and said, you have to obey this. And because, Joe Schmo in Podunk, wherever, signed this treaty with the Chinese government. We'd say, whoa, that's not our government. No, you have to obey it because this is an American citizen.
We found this one American citizen
who
who
signed the
this
treaty. And that's what went on, folks. I mean, I'm not trying to hyperbolize here. That's what went on. So I have a really hard time. I know what Justin read, and it's true. I have a really hard time with saying, well, you can do whatever you want except for what you agreed to in the treaty. Yeah, well, they didn't really agree to that stuff. Okay. And in the sense that you and I agree to do things.
So it can also be read, tribes possess all powers of self-government except those that Congress has expressly extinguished. So we can still do the treaty, but Congress can expressly extinguish one of your powers,
right,
and you can't do anything about it.
So you maybe got a power in the treaty, but now we decide that you don't get that anymore.
Yeah, we don't want you to have that
sure,
anymore, so we're just taking it away.
And I have no problem with this, right? I mean,
but we'll keep the rest of the treaty, right? Because we could dissolve the whole thing, or if we just don't feel like abiding by one of the principles of it, we can just extinguish that right expressly, and then we don't have to do what it says.
And then you want to ask me, because I know I didn't answer this part of your question, what do we need to do about it? Folks, if those examples don't tell you what we need to be working on to fix this problem, I don't know. I can't come up with a better answer. Okay. The system is inherently broken. So how about let's scrap it and start all over again with a better understanding of what needs to be done. But that's just me. That's just your friendly redneck liberal.
So one of the things that we want to talk about next, which does sort of go along with this, is the Navajo Nation becoming the largest tribe in the United States, which is actually, I mean, I think there's a lot of detail in this article about why it happened and so forth. But generally speaking, it's one of the few, positive pieces of news that you hear, because usually what we cover is the declining population of American Indians, right? And the continued decline of, there used to literally be tens of millions of them, and now there's less than 10 million. I think it's less than 5 million, right? I mean, we covered one at like 2.5 million or something that still quote unquote officially remain. And I mean, it's terribly sad that that's the state of things. At the same time, they've not given up. And that's what we're going to look at coming up is, why did that happen? And what does it tell us about what the future, both for that tribe and the nation's second largest tribe, the Cherokee Nation, might bring? So to find out, keep it here on State of Us. We'll be right back.
We are the State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Willer.
Lance says, let's throw out the system, start over, figure out something better. And of course, I think a key there, right, is we have to get the leaders, the real leaders of these tribes, right, to be on board and part of that process.
But you know what? As you say that, I'm thinking, well, the government, I guess, kind of gives me some participation, but I pretty much am in that situation as well. I would hope, though, that our government could look at this situation and whatever they did would be an improvement over what is. I agree that the leaders should have some, should be in there and point out these are the major items that need to be taken care of first. But could you, I guess you could. I mean, anything's possible, right? You could come up with a worse system than we have for the treatment of these human beings, but you'd really have to go something to accomplish that.
So as everybody knows, the pandemic, released a flurry of special legislation. And one of those was federal benefits during the coronavirus pandemic. What the Navajo Nation ultimately figured out is, well, that's going to be based on official enrollment. And one of the very important caveats that this article points out to us, Lance, is that official tribal enrollment can often be lower than a tribe's actual population because of factors including migration from reservations to urban areas and the different policies that the 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States have for determining membership. Some tribes, like the Navajo Nation, which, by the way, I think is important to point out that some of them have taken to, and this isn't a super new thing. The conversation actually was underway back in the 90s about, instead of calling themselves Navajo, that they should call themselves Dene. And that's an ongoing thing. So the article kind of uses them interchangeably, but points out that tribes like the Dene have relatively more stringent requirements than others, which have loosened such rules. Like with the Dene or the Navajo, they require 1/4 blood relation to the tribe, to be able to prove. And there's a lot of tribes that don't have that. You just have to be able to improve ancestry in order to be admitted. So there's a lot of discrepancy there. But the point is, they found a new push to this because they said, okay, wait a minute. Here the U.S. federal government has decided again that we're going to base it based off of your official enrollment, not necessarily what your, quote unquote, population might be. In other words, there are more people living on the reservation than that who are, under our care and jurisdiction, but it's based on your official enrollment.
Well, think of when we talked about a year and a half ago when we were discussing the importance of the census and collecting all the information about people and counting everybody during the pandemic and how it would have an after effect, as far as representation in Congress and drawing district lines in states and electoral college representation when we go to vote for president. That's basically what we're looking at here, right? Is that there's no systematically good way to count everybody, but when money became available because of the pandemic and the way that the different Indian nations decided to hand out the money, then people made that effort to get counted. Whereas before, whether it was, I could see if I were one of these people, I would be a stick it to the man type of person. I wouldn't be counted because why? What have you done for me? What good does it do for me to be counted? But obviously when it became monetary in a region where you need all the money you can so that you can provide for your family and survive, then they decided to be counted. So it's that's the way I look at this. It's kind of a census data collecting point that, we know there are more people living in the United States than we count every 10 years. We miss them. And that's kind of what was happening here that led to the Dene being a bigger tribe than what we had thought originally.
Exactly. Well, and that also leads to the, officially how many Native Americans are in the United States, and it depends on who you ask, and how you choose to measure that too.
Well, and what's your definition, right?
Exactly.
As far as what makes you a member of the nation, because as you pointed out in the article, there are some stricter citizenship requirements depending on what nation you're trying to become a part of.
Lance may remember that we had thrown out the idea, not the last time we had talked about this, but probably, 2 years ago now, that one thought was in the renegotiation process, you figure out a way. Obviously, it wouldn't be practical to offer, all 542 tribes some kind of statehood, option. But there might be some kind of option to offer a certain number of them where tribes could, quote unquote, band together, and some kind of revised statehood process that would actually give them, because I think one of the biggest issues is a lack of elected representation and therefore any real power inside of the government that is supposedly the ultimate authority over their affairs. So you have kind of, in my mind, there's one of two options, right? You either got to give them real sovereign authority, which for a lot of reasons, there are some practical concerns too, right? I mean, and it's not that I don't think they deserve it. I'm not saying, I'm just bringing up what some other people are pointing out, which is, okay, so the Navajo, for example, right, are now a completely sovereign nation, separate from the United States. Well, that means that they can enter into foreign relations, right? And now you could have smack dab in the middle of the United States, a group that makes a treaty, for example, with China, right? And a China military base could legally and lawfully be placed right there because they're a sovereign nation. They can make whatever treaty they want with whoever they want. And now, is that a realistic scenario? Probably not. Because if that was actually taking place, the U.S. government would do what it always does, and we're going to revise now our thinking about that, right? And this belongs to us again, kind of thing. So there's reasons that I don't think that going that route. I wish there was a practical matter of going that route, Lance, because I think that that's probably the right thing to do. Right, is to say, look, you were sovereign nations. We came in, we took over, we told you how you were going to live and where you were going to live. We should give, to the extent we can, back that ability.
Well, and to your point, there aren't a lot of good things about the land that they have, but the Navajo Nation reservation covers 27,000 square miles, which is bigger than the state of West Virginia. So as far as land size, now they don't have any very few natural resources or any way to make money on that land, but just for pure land mass, they're as big as or bigger than many states, because West Virginia is not the smallest state in the United States, land wise. So to your point, it does cover, the Navajo Nation reservation does cover a land mass big enough to make it a state, and has enough people to have representation in Congress. They meet the requirements. They would have 2 senators and 1 member in the House of Representatives based on their current numbers.
There are 10 states, Lance, that are smaller than the Navajo Nation.
So,
it's not like it's a crazy, right? It's not
right.
like,
your idea for those of you out there saying, well, you can't do that. These are little tiny reservations. They're not, here you go, folks. This one's not
tiny.
And, they have enough people that would qualify them for statehood. So it's an interesting concept. Like you said, lots and lots of details that would be needed to be worked out, but maybe that is a possibility, a way to go to start the ball rolling, to make things better than they are. And I think that's where we're in total agreement that things they could be worse, but things are really pretty bad for these native people to this land. And we need to start doing more things to correct this.
And even if you look at it from a population standpoint, the smallest state currently of population is Wyoming with 581,000. So it's not like this is a crazy stretch.
Right. They're in the ballpark.
Right.
As far as population.
At the same time, again, that's where I brought up the practicality side, that I think that's where you have to discuss with them. Look, if this is something that we want to make happen, we need to do it in a way, because you don't want to leave out all the little tiny tribes either. And again, we're not going to add 527, states either. That's right. Not practical. And you'd also have states that have, 2 senators and they have, a couple hundred.
Well, that's an interesting show, because we've been bantering about in the pre-show material about talking about statehood for Washington, D.C.
Yep.
Here's another one. So, I mean, it's kind of like there are all kinds of possibilities here, folks. I mean, of underrepresented people in the United States, not to take away on this show from the American Indians, but we maybe are kind of uncovering a trend here, Justin, of underrepresented citizens in the United States.
Yeah. So I think, and again, I don't think you force any of them into this, right? If they like the way that things are, there's certainly, I don't think that we should make any of them, quote unquote, become states, but I think we should follow a process similar to what we've had in the past where other states became states. If this is truly their sovereign territory, why not follow similar things that we followed in the past for the application of statehood and come up with some, we're going to make this many states, quote unquote, available. And if the smaller tribes want to band together, to be able to meet the requirements necessary, whatever we decide said requirements should be, obviously in concert with the American Indians.
Puerto Rico.
Yep.
I mean, come on.
We've talked about.
I'm just here, brainstorming. It's like, wow, there's more than just this group of people.
So anyway, I think, and understanding that, right, if they become a state, then there's taxation stuff and they're no longer kind of this special class of American citizen, but they become sort of full-fledged ones. And I think it takes some discussion because, again, to the point of states are not exactly sovereign entities either. There's a limit, right, to that. But again, I think entertaining, and it may not be statehood, but some kind of real, live, meaningful representation in our government is, to me, a big key to giving them part of what they deserve, which is the ability to self-determine, which right now they only have to the extent that we let them. And I'm not talking about, like what Puerto Rico has where, well, we get, a person in the U.S. House of Representatives who can't vote, but they can talk about stuff. No, it has to be somebody that has.
Well, in Washington, D.C. as well.
Right. Yeah.
They have non-voting rights.
Yes. Yeah. You got your non-voting, congressman, which is like, well, okay. What good does that do? I mean, again, the theory behind it's nice of, well, we'll give them a voice, but they don't really have a voice if they don't have a vote. So, how would you feel, right, if you lived in a state where, well, you got a representative here in Congress, but they can't vote. They can just talk. So, because then you don't get chosen right for committees and because you don't have any say on anything. So nobody takes you seriously. So there's a lot that could be done. But again, I think it's talking to them about, right, what do they need and what do they think would help them? Because maybe the ideas Lance and I have thrown out are pretty stupid and they have better ideas. And I think we have to be open to listening to them. And we want to hear your thoughts. Send us an email, podcast@thestateofus.org, because that's a key to making our mission here at True Chat a success, right, Lance?
That is true. Because here at True Chat, we have a mission, and our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And if you've liked today's conversation, please share your thoughts. Share your thoughts not only with us, but with your family and your coworkers. And when they say, well, where are you listening to such an interesting show? Tell them, well, it's this podcast called The State of Us, and it can be found on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
Tune in Tuesdays and Thursdays by 4 a.m. Eastern Time for new episodes of the podcast. You can also listen to us on syndicated radio stations across the country, so check your local talk station and see if they carry our program. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.